I met at our Boston conference earlier this year, and I'm so happy that she's able to join us today in New York City. She jumped right into Muslimish when we met her, and she is now a Boston organizer. Eman Akam was born in Saudi Arabia to Sudanese parents who then immigrated to the United States in 1998. Eman's completed a PhD in chemistry from the University of Arizona and is currently a postdoc at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. Eman is an educator, a mentor, an activist, and a Muslimish member. She holds a passion for science, mentorship, outreach, and the advancement and representation of historically marginalized communities in scientific fields. Eman today will be speaking about women in science, and I'm so excited to hear what she has to say. Welcome.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for everybody who was involved in putting this conference together. It's a really nice event. Before I start the talk, I just want to preface it by saying that the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today, although I am a scientist, I don't produce any research in the area that I'm talking about to you today. It's just an area of interest to me. Also, I was going to make this talk really specific about women, specifically about women, the advancement of women in STEM fields, but I kind of decided to make it a little bit more general. So I'll first start out with a scenario, and as I go through the scenario, I just really like you to picture it in your mind. So the scenario is a chemistry professor is highly upset with an administrative assistant. The administrative assistant failed to submit an order for a chemical that was urgently needed, and the chemical was to be used in an upcoming study that was to be carried out by a graduate student. So by a show of hands, I'd just like to know how many people imagine this chemistry professor as a white male. A female, a white female? Yeah. A person of color? Okay. Liar. I'm just kidding. So distribution is probably more or less what we would get if we surveyed a larger population in the U.S., a larger portion of the population in the U.S. And that's because in the U.S. we do hold a stereotype that science is very masculine, that science is a male-dominated profession. And we get these stereotypes through our communications with our parents and our peers, so they relate certain stereotypes to us. And we also pick some of these stereotypes up from the media. And children as young as 5 years old already identify some cultural norms related to gender, race, physical attractiveness, etc. And so because we have these stereotypes, because we hold these, because we're exposed to these stereotypes, we then tend to give certain identities, we develop hierarchies in terms of identities. And so we hold certain identities to be more important in the United States and more valued. So being white, being male, being young, being heterosexual, Christian, rich, physically able, etc. And stigmatized people have have identities that deviate from those standards. So what I really want to focus on today is implicit bias. And implicit bias is essentially from the stereotypes that we're exposed to, we then kind of internalize these, and then they show up or manifest themselves as implicit bias. These are deeply rooted associations that shape our expectations of people. It really permeates how we see people and how we see ourselves, and also how we treat people. And because they operate both on an individual and institutional level, they can give rise to explicit bias. So this happens because we're constantly overloaded with information, so our brain, or we're exposed to about 11 million bits or pieces of information per second at any given time. And we're consciously only aware of 40. So because we really want to get the most out of the information that we're exposed to, we have to categorize all this information. That way we can kind of get the most out of it. And so effectively our brain take mental shortcuts, and we do this through categorization. And this is important because from an evolutionary perspective, we have to kind of be able to identify new things and then categorize them quickly, especially, let's say, if our lives are in danger, we have to be able to look at something new and see whether or not it's important to pay attention to. So we have to be able to categorize these things, but the problem comes when we, in the fact that when we do categorize, we tend to exaggerate the differences between groups while also kind of ignoring the differences within groups. And this is demonstrated really well by this experiment that was done by Patchville and Wilkes in the 1960s. And what these researchers did is they showed two groups of people a set of lines. And the set of lines were identical in each case, except that one group was shown the lines without any labels, and the other group was shown the line with labels. And later, when the subjects of the experiment were asked to recall the lines, the group that was shown the lines without any labels recalled them more or less correctly. But the group that was shown the line with labels recalled them something like this, where the differences between the groups were a lot exaggerated. So it's true that the A group in this case is shorter than the B group, but in this case the lines, the differences were exaggerated, and the differences within the group were kind of diminished. So we do this categorization process in everything that we deal with. And we of course do this also when we deal with people. So we tend to categorize people along salient dimensions. We tend to consider our in-groups to be more complex than the out-groups. So when we categorize, we have our in-groups, this is the group that I belong to, and the out-groups of those people. And those people are all the same. They're all the same. And because we think we already know, we tend to take any characteristic that we see from any individual member of that group and apply it to the whole group. And also because we think we already know, we tend to ask fewer questions. And when we do ask questions, we tend to ask questions that will kind of confirm any stereotypes that we already have. So this is the basis of confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is a very interesting phenomenon in where we, if I hold a stereotype about a group of people, and I'm exposed to 10 pieces of information, one which confirms any biases that I have and 9 others that don't, I'll hold the one that confirms my stereotype or my assumption to a higher weight than the other 9 pieces of information. So this leads us to see exactly what we want to see. So for a long time, it was difficult to bring out these implicit biases because they're rooted at a level that's deeper than the conscious, our consciousness. And one game changer was these implicit associations tests that were developed by Drs. Benaji and Greenwald. And if you haven't taken one of these, I highly suggest that you do so at implicit.harvard.edu. And so these tests are essentially a set of tasks that require categorizations, and then you would just be asked to categorize things into different groups to the left or right. I won't go through how the test is categorized, but depending on how fast you complete these tasks, this informs about any biases that you might hold. And intuitively, this makes sense because it's easier for us to categorize things that we consider similar rather than things that we find dissimilar. And we've learned a lot from these implicit association tests. We know that associations like these are very pervasive, and they're triggered automatically. They bypass consciousness, they operate on a subconscious level, so they can persist even when we don't want them to. And they affect all of us, regardless of our in-groups. And just because, for example, for me, because I'm a female and I'm black, does not mean that I'll automatically not, or I'm exempt from having a pro-white or pro-male bias. And of course, they can run contrary to our stated beliefs and attitudes. They definitely influence our judgment and behavior, and again, they operate on individual and institutional levels, so they have some very broad implications. So just simply being aware of that these biases exist does not automatically mean that we'll overcome them. And in the case of women in science, these definitely have some very real effects on retention and recruitment. So for example, a stereotype might be that girls are bad at science or bad at math. So girls and all of us would be exposed to things like this in the media, where allergic to algebra, a t-shirt for girls, I'm too pretty to do math. So we could be exposed to things like this, and that would kind of solidify the stereotype that science is male or masculine. And then when we, because of this, so me as a female, I could think that because science is very masculine, I'm not even interested in science, that I'm not good at it, and maybe that will deter me from even trying to pursue it. And that will kind of further perpetuate the stereotype and solidify it. So this has a real effect on the recruitment because it complicates women's relationship to science. And it's very evidenced if you look at the general population of the US versus the population of scientists and engineers in the US. So white women and white men each make up about 31% of the population, but white men make up about 49% of the population of practicing scientists and engineers, and white women make up only 18% of that population, although they make up 31% of the general population. So white men are overrepresented in science and engineering, and white women are underrepresented, and this gets worse if you look at the breakdown for other races. And over in the literature, we see that women are evaluated more harshly than men. In this case, I'm just showing some examples from the literature that focus on scientists, like women scientists, or women in science. But this is true in a lot of other fields. So the current estimate is that a woman would have to produce about 2.5 times the amount of work in order to be considered equal to a man. So this, of course, has effects on retention of women. So even once we get women interested in science, we can't keep them there because they're not progressing to the top as fast as men are. And I was focusing on women in science, but this is actually an issue that affects a lot of other marginalized communities. So in this recent report by the Brookings Institution, they showed that although black students make up only 18% of preschool enrollment, they represent 48% of students that receive at least one out-of-school detention or suspension. And this is indicative of this phenomenon. It's called the school-to-prison pipeline. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about women in STEM in Muslim-majority countries. And it wasn't really a topic that I explored too much until I joined Muslimish. But if you do like a quick search of the popular media, you would see a lot of headlines that would indicate that the gap between men and women in Muslim-majority countries in terms of studying science has been essentially closed. And like this article suggests that there's something for us to learn from these countries. But I have a few things to say about that. One thing that I want to say is that in this recent report that came out actually this month, it summarized the literature that exists so far, and there is a lot of consistency in terms of women having lower levels of education than men in Muslim-majority countries. But there are other reports that argue that because there is so much variation between Muslim-majority countries, it's really difficult to kind of make that up as a blanket statement. And those same reports state that there's really a trend towards convergence, that we're closing the gap in Muslim-majority countries, and the gap is actually more or less similar to that observed in Western countries. And in this recent report, they kind of came to the same conclusion, and they showed that the gender gaps in education of women, in the degrees that women are getting in science fields, are closing, especially across generations. But I think that's not a full picture. This other study that came out also this year showed that there's a negative correlation between the number of females that are graduating from STEM fields and the global gender gap. So in more gender equal countries, there are less females graduating with STEM degrees, and in countries where the global gender gap index or the global gender gap is larger, more females are graduating with STEM degrees. And the hypothesis, the hypothesis that these authors came up with is that women in gender equal countries tend to pursue careers just out of passion and interest, while women in Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries pursue STEM careers to gain financial freedom. The other thing that I want to talk about or mention is that I do think that education in the Muslim majority countries is not the whole story. So this is the Global Gender Gap Report, the latest one that came out in 2017. This looked at 144 major and emerging economies, and they looked at the gender gap in terms of economic participation, so whether or not women are actually getting jobs and participating in the economy, educational attainment, which is what all these other studies that I showed previously looked at, political empowerment, meaning whether or not females are involved in government, and their access to healthcare. And this is a summary of this report, and I know you can't see it, so I'm just going to turn it on its side in a second. So here, on the right-hand side is the country with the smallest gender gap, and on the left-hand side is the country with the largest gender gap. So this is Yemen, and this is Iceland, and the global weighted average is here. So I kind of just went through all these countries that are shown here, and I looked at them in terms of Islam, and I broke it down by whether or not, like the involvement of Islam in the laws of the country, in the government. So the countries that have Sharia law are shown in red. In burgundy are countries that have Islam as a state religion. And secular states are shown here. So these are Muslim majority countries that are secular. And then countries that don't have a declared religion are shown in green. So I just found that it's interesting that a lot of the countries, actually 16 out of the 18 countries that have the largest gender gaps are all Muslim majority countries. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't think we have enough literature as of yet to really come to any conclusions. And the field is still pretty new. Like we're just now in the Western world looking at implicit bias and things like that. I think those are definitely operational in those other countries. We just haven't gotten there in terms of looking at these. So just to summarize, I've shown you that implicit bias is distinct from conscious bias. That's something that operates at a subconscious level. We all have these biases because we're exposed to culture, and they affect our behavior unless we really put mechanisms into place to override them. And the picture in the Muslim majority, the literature right now shows that the gender gap is pretty much closed in Muslim majority countries. I don't think that that's the whole story. Maybe just in terms of education that's true, but that's not the whole story. And it's really important to think about these issues because most of the systemic inequality and harm that impacts marginalized communities comes from implicit forms of bias, not explicit. But the current interventions that we have focus on overt and explicit forms of bias. So that's all I have to say, and thank you.